We had a public meeting approximately 2 weeks ago at which we heard comments and received testimony about them. And so now we're coming back to discuss how we should deal with the comments that we heard and any additional thoughts, which is then going to lead us towards a vote as to whether the committee approves the draft regulations. If we do so, they would then be forwarded to the board meeting in an hour or so, 2 hours or so, and the board would then vote to issue the regulations. Did I say that correctly? Okay. So Lois, I'm going to turn it over to you then to lead us through the discussion. Is that correct?
Sure, and I will immediately turn it over to Kara and Lindsay to talk about the regulations.
Great, thank you. Good morning. I feel very far away for a committee meeting. Great, so as you know, PIPs are the HPC's primary enforcement mechanism for the benchmark. They allow the HPC, along with the payer or the provider undergoing a PIP, to understand the cost drivers that led to the entity's growth and to implement best practices to address those drivers. Those practices must be proposed by the payer or provider undergoing a PIP and can take the form of things such as changing to pricing structure, referral patterns, care delivery reforms, etc. As you know, the maximum timetable for implementation is 18 months, and throughout that process, the HPC is engaged in monitoring and receiving reports from the entity on its progress. So we're very excited to be here today after over 2 years of work developing these regulations. First, the development of the interim guidance that was released last March. And then since that time, over the last 12 months, we've met with this committee several times, as well as the board, to solicit your input and feedback. We have worked with key stakeholders, particularly payers and providers who would be subject to the process. We have met with expert consultants at the HPC. We've met with our sister agencies. And as Dr. Cutler mentioned, we most recently had the public comment period as well as the public hearing on March 15th. We did receive 5 comments on the draft regulation. We did not receive any comments on the forms and instructions document that we also put out for comment. And so I will turn it over to Ramsey Hoge, who is a policy associate on the market performance team and one of the lead analysts on the performance improvement plan project, to walk you through the comments we received and staff's proposed changes to the regulation.
Good morning, Commissioners. During the public comment period, we received comments from the Beth Israel Deaconess Care Organization, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Massachusetts Association of Health Plans, Partners Healthcare System, and the Steward Healthcare System. The first set of comments we received from Blue Cross Blue Shield and Partners concerned the process before the board would vote to require a performance improvement plan on a named entity. These commenters suggested that in order to protect entities' due process rights, that they have the opportunity to review data and documents relied upon by the board to reach a recommendation to require a performance improvement plan, and to meet with the HPC and to potentially contest the recommendation to require a performance improvement plan. Staff generally would agree with these concerns and would recommend adding a new section to the regulation, 10.043, which would state that prior to a board vote to require a PIP, that the board would notify the entity and give the entity the opportunity to review data and documents that were used to reach the conclusion that a PIP would be recommended. In addition, the recommended addition to the regulation would say that the entity would have the opportunity to meet with the executive director before the board vote to require a plan.
Just a quick clarification. Are either they or we also suggesting that there be some sort of a written kind of, when they contest something, would that be in writing or would this all just be at a discussion level? And Lois, does it matter?
I'll just pipe in and say it doesn't matter. I think the key point here is that there's an opportunity to review, whether in writing or in person, all the data and information that the staff has used to do the consideration that potentially a PIP should be voted on by the board, and whether or not it's sort of in written submissions or additional information. That's just an opportunity, however they choose to avail themselves of it.
Now, if the benchmark is changed, right, then it will be the new benchmark that CHIA would then look to, and then we would look to.
That's correct. If we, CHIA would, in reference to the benchmark and using its methodology for identifying entities that they send to us, they would be referencing the 3.1 benchmark, unless we take other action. Right.
The next few comments that we received concerned the sections of the regulation listing the factors that the board would consider when determining whether to require a PIP, whether to approve a proposed PIP to go forward with implementation, or whether to consider a completed PIP to have been implemented successfully. The Massachusetts Association of Health Plans recommended a number of additional factors that would be used to determine whether to implement the PIP. These are listed on the slide here. In response to these factors, the HPC agrees, or the staff agrees, that many of them are potentially useful in evaluating the entity, and that the board could look at them during the review process. We would recommend adding an additional factor to the regulation, and that would be the cost structure of the entity that the board would be reviewing. In addition, we would recommend adding a catch-all factor or any other factors the Commission considers relevant to the regulation to be consistent with those sections of the regulation dealing with when a proposed PIP would be considered successful and when an implemented PIP would be deemed to have been completed successfully.
Some of these are pretty sort of internal to the operation. I'm a little concerned about what role we play versus the organizations in terms of how much we get into the middle of their world.
I think we agree, and I think that's why, rather than adding each of these specific factors into the regulation, we've added cost structure specifically, but have opted to go with the broader any other factor the commission considers relevant. Because I think we agree some of these factors may not have anything to do with the variables that we're looking at, particularly on spending.
It's really the other way around. If they're running, say, at 5.5%, we say, look, hey, you know, the benchmark is 3, whatever, and you're at 5.5, what's going on? I mean, it shouldn't be us getting into, then they come to us and say, well, you know, we're doing this and we're doing that. Say, fine, we're beginning, as opposed to us saying, oh, and by the way, your referral patterns have changed. You see what I'm saying? That's, I don't want us running their organization. I mean, we're not in a position to do it.
I think we agree. I think that's something that we got from many members of this committee and the board as feedback on how we
And
design.
I think the tension here, Stuart, is exactly that. Some of the people who commented wanted to have a kind of bright line rule, as in, we will require a performance improvement plan if X, Y, and Z, and either Q or R, but not F and G. And so they wanted to know exactly when it was going to happen. And I think what you're saying, which is where the committee is look, we have an overarching thought here, which is this going to put us at risk of exceeding the cost threshold? And anything that goes into that, we're going to think about, but that's our overarching risk, and we may consider the rest of it as appropriate, but we can't lay out an algorithm which is going to tell us what to do. And they said, well, please lay out an algorithm. And I think the answer is no, but we will at least specify more of the things that will enter into the algorithm.
I think we're all on the same page.
Yeah. And in some sense, it's like our CMIRs. We don't have an algorithm that says, here's the line, but we try to lay out as clearly as we can what things go into our determination.
The next comments that we received from BIDCO and MAP suggested that we consider the overall regulatory environment during the PIPS process. They suggested that the impacts of any changes to the Affordable Care Act, as well as the impact of any state level reforms that might flow out of the concern about provider price variation, could potentially impact these entities' ability to control their costs or to maintain insurance coverage. Staff agrees that regulatory developments could certainly impact the entity's business operations and their costs and their ability to maintain insurance coverage. However, at this point, we do not recommend a change to the text of the regulation because the overall regulatory environment could be considered under the existing factors, including factors leading to increased costs that are outside of the identified entity's control. The newly added, the recommended factor of any other factors that the Commission considers relevant, and the existing factors within the regulation.
Back up very quickly and mention the Stewart comment on the previous slide, which is very similar to the comment from Matt, which was a recommendation to add a specific metric into consideration, which is the weighted average payer rate. This is a metric that considers not only pricing patterns, but also payer mix combined. So in response to that factor, we have proposed adding payer mix specifically into the regulation, not specifically adding in this proposed metric, but we think having payer mix in combination with existing factors on pricing patterns would allow us to look at this or similar metrics.
We received a comment from BIDCO. I believe I referred to that earlier. BIDCO suggested that there should be a clear numerical standard for the significant concern that would require a performance improvement plan. BIDCO said that this would promote clarity and consistency in the PIPS process. Staff is on the same page with Dr. Cutler concerning this recommendation. We recommend that the review process be a case-by-case consideration of each entity's particular circumstances and the factors leading to their cost growth, considering the wide range of factors that are listed in the text of the regulation. BIDCO also suggested that should the board deny a request for an extension to file a PIP, that the denial notice include the reason for the denial. Staff recommend adding to the regulation that the notice would in fact include the reason for the denial. BIDCO also suggested that the notification that a PIP proposal was considered unacceptable or incomplete by the board should include or should be by hard copy and by electronic copy both. Staff don't recommend a change to the regulation because the relevant section already says that we will notify the PIP entity of the decision, and at this point in the process the entity would have already submitted a proposed PIP with contact information for people at the entity, and the board would already have been in contact with the entity during the development of the proposed PIP.
Is there something behind this? Because they,
I'm sure.
they're afraid the mail will go work on it.
Well, it shows that they read every word of the proposed regulation.
The federal government is going to have reduced post office.
One additional change to the regulation that the staff is recommending is to add a section to 10.16, which deals with the process for requiring a CMIR on a named provider entity. There was an unintentional omission of the requirement to have a board vote to implement a CMIR. So that's going to be addressed with the recommended section 10.16.3. In addition, staff would recommend that this process include similar opportunities as in the PIPS process for the entity to be on notice and to be given the opportunity to review data used by the board in determining that a CMIR might be warranted, and to meet with the executive director before the board votes.
Any questions on changes to the regulation? Great. I will turn it over to Lois.
So you see on this slide, just reviewing again the many stages in the PIP process, the 6 major stages from when CHIA first provides that confidential list to the HPC of entities that they've identified who have excessive cost growth, and then the steps for the HPC to perform that gated review and analysis according to the factors that we've laid out in the regulation, and then the requirement of a PIP, the submission of a proposed PIP, the approval of the PIP, implementation, and then after implementation, the determination about whether or not it was successful. So through these 6 stages, we believe that it was appropriate to have a complementary document that laid out a process for consideration of PIPs by the board and as between the commissioners and the executive director and staff to facilitate in a practical way the implementation of this regulation. So we developed a process to clarify communications with PIP entities as well as timely communication between the staff and commissioners given what is confidential at different stages in this process. We followed a model that we used, as you may recall, back in 2013 when we first implemented. It was actually under the interim guidance for the initiation of MCN and CMIR process, where we developed a policy which indicated different stages and touch points between staff and commissioners prior to an initiation of a CMIR. We followed that same process here to try to balance between getting in our statutory and regulatory context, including confidentiality, open meeting law considerations, as well as promoting sort of efficient staff administration of the process. And just a reminder here about confidentiality in the PIPS process. The law provides that the list provided to the HPC by CHIA is confidential, and the name of any entity on that list is not posted publicly until the board votes to initiate a PIP. So the law requires that we post that on our website. And so we treat that process and that the name of entities under consideration as confidential. Also, the commission is required under our statute to keep confidential certain non-public information, clinical information, strategic or financial information provided to us in the course of HIP-related activities. And so those are the sort of touch points we need to keep in mind about the information that we share publicly as well as communicate with the board. And so our recommended policy, which you've had in your packet and we're going to walk through the different steps, outlines for each step in the statutory process when the executive director will provide information to commissioners, much of which, as I mentioned, may be confidential, how commissioners will provide input to staff, and when board votes are required. And although it's not expressly in this process document, I do want to talk also about some options for board meetings at which PIP votes are expected.
And also indicate about this committee's work, because if I recall last year, we went through potential PIPs A, B, C, and D without making the names be public in terms of what we did as a committee. So if you could include some of that too.
Sure, and that absolutely, and in terms of regular touch points and updates and doing it in a way that sort of regularly updates both the committee and the board on the process, that's absolutely contemplated.
Let me bring up an issue. I don't know if all of you heard this, but we're going to be reviewing what's likely going forward with respect to the workload of the whole commission and the committee assignments. And it's quite likely that we definitely are going to restructure the committees. And we may consolidate the committees and try to bring about some more uniformity in terms of workload. So no particular commission or committee feels overworked or underworked. So I've been thinking about this a little bit, and I just this could be a major issue for the commission going forward. In terms, when you just think about it, particularly if we put together a tight future benchmark in a very complicated medical environment, you could wind up with a very significant number of institutions becoming potentially, right? I mean, you'd like to say. So let's just bear in mind that in the future, it may turn out that we decide to reallocate where things are. So I'm not trying to take anything away from you, David, or the committee. I just want to lay out the idea that David is going to be bringing to us a revised workload kind of stuff, and we may be restructuring the committee. that, I don't have anything else to say, other than I see this as becoming a major part of the future of the commission. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. And you'll, actually, the policy itself that we have doesn't specifically mention a role for the committee per se, but that could be something that is addressed in future discussions. So the following slides that you see sort of walk through those 6 performance improvement plan steps. And then there's 2 additional steps, which include the assessment of penalties as well as the initiation of the CMIR. So just moving to the first step, which is when CHIA sends that confidential list, the list would be provided to all commissioners, and commissioners may provide input to the executive director or the chair. That's the method that we have used with the MCN process, where there is sort of input to staff to assist them in their review and analysis of that list in accordance with the factors and the regulations, sort of making that sort of gated review informed by commissioner input. For step 2, which I think is, as Commissioner Cutler sort of pointed out, that this may be the most sort of significant step here, which is the determination about whether or not to require a PIP. And that sort of culminates based on a process that the staff undergoes in terms of the gated review. But what this process lays out is that information about the results of that staff review would be provided to commissioners, as well as recommendations to conclude the review for probably many entities, and then seek additional information from the few that we want to sort of proceed and go forward. And so we would provide those recommendations to commissioners and seek their input. Commissioners may provide that input about the recommendations. We'd also, if we did seek additional information, provide that information, or at least a summary of that, to commissioners as their interest. And if any entity requests an opportunity to meet pursuant to that new section, we propose adding, commissioners will be notified about that. The board then would vote on whether or not to initiate or require a PIP. And at that point, once that vote happens, that entity of the PIP is made public. And here, although it's not laid out in the policy itself, I just want to sort of talk about some options for that vote process and keeping that information confidential. As Commissioner Cutler mentioned, to date, we have described entities without naming and talked at a very high level about the review and whether or not we identified concerns. But the board could, based on research I've done, go into executive session for the purpose of deliberating about whether or not to require a PIP, or could continue the practice of, identifying provider A or health plan B and talk at a higher level to have a public deliberation. And that isn't something that needs to be decided now. It could be decided, on a case-by-case basis. And any decision to go into executive session would be done in an open meeting, and there's a certain process to be followed. But because the law requires us to keep the name of the entity confidential, it allows us, it's a very limited opportunity to go into executive session. It's really only for the purpose of protecting the confidentiality of that entity. So that is something we happy to talk about that further, but or the board may decide to have an open meeting and not disclose the name of the entity until that vote occurs.
What about the information? When you say the name, so we're discussing a particular entity, so the name is confidential. But what about all the information that they've provided in a confidential way?
The information is also confidential,
So if we're going to go into an executive session, can the full board then review that information in executive session?
yes.
Because I'm less concerned about the name. I'm not unconcerned about it, but I mean, if we're going to really do a serious job and still honor people's confidentiality with respect to information, I would suspect either a full board or a significant number of members of the board are gonna wanna go into that information, not just leave it to the staff.
Right, and so what we're contemplating is that that information is provided to commissioners even before any deliberation. So commissioners have an ability to, the staff can provide summaries or provide the actual documents or come in and review it. All of that is available to the
I'm
board.
discussing it, it's not.
But we have to keep it confidential
Correct.
ourselves.
But that can be part of the confidential, or the executive session deliberation.
That makes sense.
So, if the board does vote to require a PIP in any circumstance, there's an opportunity, the next step is the entity has an opportunity to request a waiver. So basically, don't require a PIP of me at this time, or an extension to file the PIP. We provided, in the regulation, minor extensions of up to 45 days would just be administratively approved or denied by the executive director. Longer extensions would require a vote of the board, and any waiver of the requirement also would be a vote of the board. And any requests that we receive along those lines would be provided to the commissioners, as well as supporting information arguments in favor of that. And so likewise, that would be a vote. And at all of these stages, there's an opportunity to consider the confidentiality and as to how the board wants to make that vote. The next step would be approval of the proposed PIP. And this also is we anticipate some iteration with the PIP entity. As you know, the PIP itself is proposed by the entity, but the statute does anticipate approval of that. And so there will be some back and forth. And so what the policy anticipates is that staff would provide information related to the development of the PIP proposal, staff analysis of the proposals, and commissioner feedback on that, or recommendations regarding that would be transmitted back to staff. Again, the board has authority to vote to approve that PIP. With respect to implementation, as the regulation lays out, we anticipate reporting to the board, both in public meetings as well as through periodic reports about implementation. And during the PIP process, an entity may have an opportunity to seek amendments to it. Minor amendments, whether it's procedural or non-material amendments, could be approved by the executive director, but significant proposed amendments would need to be approved by the board. So the board continues to have an oversight role in the implementation of a PIP, and this process just lays out, providing, full transparency with the board about how that's going. Finally, at the conclusion of the PIP, again, information about, that we get from the entity about how the PIP has proceeded and has it been successful, what have been the results, because the board needs to vote on a determination of whether or not the PIP was successful. And so all information relevant to that question provided by the entity, again, would be provided to the board. So I'll just stop there because those are the 6 stages of the PIP process.
Lois, does the statute provide for a length of time for the PIP? I mean, is there a year or 6 months? Is that in the statute?
18 months is contemplated.
Maximum? Sure. Yeah.
And just there, at the conclusion, if the board determines that the PIP hasn't been successful, there's an opportunity for the board to maybe extend the PIP or take further action. But the statute contemplates, not a very long-term process, but an 18-month window.
Lois, this is just a technical question. I think you've done a really nice job, particularly in laying it out for us, of what these steps would be. At the same time, we've never been through one. Is what you laid out for the implementation process suppose we go through 2 and we learn that we really need to change a couple of things. Does that have to go back through any regulatory change, or is this just internal to the staff and the board to make those changes? You would bring them back to us, we would agree. To what degree is this a blend of regulation and process, or just the process to implement the regulation?
This is intended to be, this policy document is just a policy, sub-regulatory, if you will. It's not a regulation, it's not through public comment period. This is a document of the board, and the board can change it at any time.
But the earlier discussion would be a regulation.
The earlier one, I do understand the regulatory language. I was just thinking, you always want to kind of do a dry run in order to figure out what's extraneous, what to leave out, and I was just interested in what it was going to take to make those changes in the future.
Yeah,
For
it would just
example, last
be,
year, we spent an enormous amount of time on step 1. We developed, we think, processes that we hadn't envisioned. None of us had envisioned that we were going to do there. So it's entirely likely that as we go through 2 through 6, the same thing would occur.
right.
Thank you.
Sure, our effort here is to present something to be responsive to just, to the sense that since we haven't done this, being clear about at what point and what types of information the board would need to make these decisions, and sort of the role of staff in facilitating that review. So the next step laid out here is the assessment of the penalty. As you know, the statute allows the HPC to assess a civil penalty where the entity has willfully failed to file a PIP or failed to implement the plan in good faith or knowingly failed to provide information, and the board votes to assess the penalty. The regulations do provide an opportunity for a hearing and an opportunity for sort of notice and hearing and typical due process. There would then be a written issued decision, and depending upon the administrative decision, the penalty would be assessed. The last step is initiating a CMIR. As you know, in years where the Commonwealth as a whole has not met the benchmark, the Health Policy Commission has the ability to do a CMIR on any of those identified entities by CHIA. And so here, unlike the initiation of a CMIR in the MCN context, where that is a staff-initiated review given the time frame, and then it's later endorsed by the board. Here, there's an opportunity, we're not under a time frame, so all consideration of whether or not to initiate a CMIR in this context would be determined by vote of the board, and the policy provides that information relevant to that determination would be provided to commissioners, including any summary analysis of staff or staff recommendations, and that would be a board vote to initiate a CMIR in that context.
Placing lots of votes on the board.
Yes. A lot of votes.
I think that's probably appropriate given the importance of these issues.
Yeah.
Is that the board do this?
So the final slide here should look very familiar. It's our typical outline slide. So just by way of recap, if this committee votes to advance the final proposed regulation to the board and the board votes to issue the regulation, it would become effective April 21st. And then on the top side of this slide, you see the same general timeframe we've been discussing, which is receipt of the list, gated review of the entities in the spring, and then potential for a vote as early as July or possibly later based on some of the new steps that have been added into the process regarding due process.
And we received the list imminently.
Correct.
Let me see whether Rick.
And just to clarify one thing for me, so the list that we get imminently, we're gonna be looking at it versus the benchmark of 2.6. So as Stuart mentioned, later we may decide to keep it at 3.1 for 2018. So the earliest we're gonna be looking at the list, comparing it to 3.1 is in 2019, is that right? So 2 years from now.
Actually, even longer. CHIA is contemplating a change to the way that they are identifying entities on this list, and they, while they haven't finalized this rule, are contemplating using only final data, and so that information is actually another year removed. So if that rule goes into place, it would be 2020 would be the year that we would have a list of entities that potentially exceeded the 3.1% benchmark for 2018. We'll know in 2019 whether or not we exceeded the benchmark on a statewide basis, but it would be a whole, given the current timeframes, a whole nother year removed before we have the identified list of entities. So we set the target prospectively, and then there's a retroactive review of the data.
So next year, we'd be looking at entities that exceeded the 3.6 benchmark this year.
One of the reasons for this, if I recall correctly, is last year there was a fairly significant variance between the initial estimates by CHIA and the final estimates by CHIA, with a number of payers and providers moving quite significantly, if I recall correctly.
So I wouldn't necessarily say that the overall variation was significant, but for any individual entity it can be, and of course we want to be able to take that into account.
Right, and so we really don't want to be in a situation where we make a determination on the basis of preliminary data that's then very significantly revised for a particular entity.
And last year, and this current year and going forward, we have consistently given more weight in our thoughts and analysis to that final data and have used the preliminary data more as a signal as to where things might be going rather than any fact of what's happened.
There are two items that we need to vote upon. The first is advancing the final regulation to the Commission for its consideration this afternoon. And then the second is endorsing the policy on process for the initiation of performance improvement plans, which then the board would vote upon, but it's not in the same way as the regulation for the reasons that Wendy was laying. If there are, unless people have other comments to make, I would propose that we proceed to a vote on each of these in turn. So the first vote is to approve the advancement of the final regulation. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any in opposition? Okay, so the committee votes in favor unanimously. And the second is the policy on process, endorsing the policy on process.
So moved.
All those in favor?
Aye.
And any in opposition? Okay, so the committee unanimously endorses that as well. Thank you. Thank you on both counts for dealing very, very nicely and comprehensively with the comments and for helping us think through the process that we should use for this. That concludes our formal work of the committee. Let me just ask whether anyone in the audience wishes to make comments or suggestions or add anything. If not, we will stand adjourned until the full commission meets at noon.